So you were saying that like with overdrive pedals, you don't have like specific favorites that are necessarily like the big three that most people are into, like the Klon or the Timmy or Tube Screamer, stuff like that.
You know, I definitely know like when I was younger and you don't have as much gear,
Yeah.
right? Um, it was so easy for me to go to like the one here in Nashville that we RIP was called Rock Block Guitars
Yeah, yeah. I remember it.
over off Elliston, and I used to go in there all the time. We also had another place here actually before that, like before when I was like still like waiting tables when I was like 18 and wasn't even making my living as a guitar player. There was a place called Broadway Used Music here in
Okay.
town, and they were like, this would have predated eBay and
Yeah,
Craigslist,
yeah.
and that's where if you had music gear, if it was cases, like road cases, guitars, pedals, and whatever, if you wanted to dump something, that's where you took it to sell. Or like the
Gotcha.
Traders Post in here in America, you
Yep.
flip through the Traders Post. Um, but point is having one guitar and one amp, kind of or even just a really small, maybe two guitars and an amp or whatever. It was so easy to kind of go chase the muse by, maybe you had $150 that extra that I'd scraped together from waiting tables or whatever, and go play a new pedal and a new, whether it was an overdrive or a delay or anything, and kind of go in there and be like, anything cool, and they're like,
Yeah.
man, you got to check these out. This thing's called a Tammy pedal or whatever it was,
Yeah, yeah.
and that was such an immediate way to kind of feel like you were inspired or something to keep you wanting to play,
Yeah, yeah.
where you'd go in and you get this new pedal and not only would you spend time at the store messing with it, but then when you got it home, I remember like just sitting like cross-legged in the floor for like days when I got a new pedal, like any chance I got to just futz with it and find all the edges of it and
Yep.
chase sounds. And I definitely, after I had was doing pretty good for myself touring, and then certainly like when my session career kind of started, and you have a little bit of walking around money, the gear acquisition syndrome was real,
Yep.
and I was definitely like again Rock Block, places like that. I was Corner Music was another good one here in town.
Yeah, yeah.
Rock Block was like the pedal store,
Yeah.
and I was in there. They just had two huge glass cases of just stuff, and I was always in there checking out a new pedal, and they were starting to get cool new amps in there. The first place I ever played a Dr. Z amp was
Yeah.
Rock Block, stuff like that. And but yeah, over time, as my gear collection really grew, and you start having a few more amps and a few more guitars, um, you start kind of realizing like, oh, well, that pedal sounds way different with my Telly than it does this, Les Paul.
Yep.
And it sounds way different with my Princeton than it does this Marshall head or, whatever. And then, for me too, there was a moment in my career where I kind of settled into the way I set my amps, which is, again, moves around a lot. But like if someone put a gun to my head and we're like, get a sound out of this amp,
Yeah.
it's always going to be this kind of like right at the edge of breakup
Yeah.
kind of amp sound. That's what I'm always going to pull, with no pedals on.
Yep.
And so, yeah, eventually you just get to this point where you go, man, all these pedals are cool. Like they all sound kind of cool and they all kind of do a thing. And then when cascade that line of thought from like all these pedals are cool to I also have all these different kind of options of this guitar and this amp and this thing and this thing, and it's like it really at some point there in my 20s it really transferred from like trying to find like a new cool delay pedal or a new cool overdrive pedal, and more so just having a handful of options and being able to kind of click through them or plug them in and whatever, and just be inspired by whatever that is, like the unique mid-range a tube screamer has versus what a Klon does to the front end of an amp, or what a Distortion does, or whatever. And I definitely have favorites, I think, kind of, or maybe favorites not even the word, definitely have go-tos.
Yeah.
But that's a big reason that, like, whenever you see me working, I've got a handful of pedal boards that I've had built, or sometimes I'm just plugging shit in, but like, there's always like 2 or 3 or 4 overdrive pedals or boost pedals or some sort of gain staging component, because so much of what I do is just, you're sitting there getting a sound and you're just clicking it and you're going, that's cool. Oh, that's pretty cool. I like the way that sounds. And you just turn a knob and you're off to the races.
Yeah.
And that's really how I've utilized pedals, period, across the board for so many years. I also think, coincidentally, it's why people think it's so funny that I still use the old Line 6 M9s. And that, it's like I can't do one of these without it coming up, or somebody messaging me, and being like, is it modded? Like, what do you? And I'm like, no, I've never had a modded one. Like, I started using these. There's a lot of bang for the buck in them. And I think they sound really good, and they work great, like, in all the ways that I want to use them through a lot of different amps. And so, I have other delay pedals that I love, and I have other modulation pedals that I love, and they all do different things. But I got really over that era of going and trying the new, like, delay pedal by Diamond, or finding the new delay pedal by Empress, or trying the new delay pedal by whoever it was, because at a point you just go like, man, these are all really cool.
Yep.
And they all do cool stuff,
Yeah, I find with modulation, I'm less, like, for me, like, collecting pedals, I'll get more modulation pedals, but I find I'm almost always going back to, if I just want something I can turn knobs, MXR Carbon Copy is what I'm going to use.
Yep.
Otherwise, it's normally, I have Strymon Timeline that I have the 2 or 3 presets that I'll actually use. But, I've got things that, I got the Source Audio Collider. It sounds amazing. But then I got to learn another whole new interface and figure out how it works. And, honestly, I don't think any of them really sound that much better than, like, the old Line 6 DL4s. I still think are one of the best sounding of all of those. So I love finding new sounds because of exactly what you kind of touched on, which is that, getting a new pedal, to me, even if it's something that I already have the same voice in, there might be some new thing that gives some sort of new inspiration to your playing. Just doing exactly that, like plugging it in, turning knobs, and being like, oh yeah, like that's cool. Like, like Rob was just telling me about this ODR1 clone by Karma that he was like, he sent me a text with a picture of it saying, have you tried this? And I'm like, no, but now I want to, because I like I have an ODR1. I know there's a lot of guys that don't love those pedals, but I like it and I can get along with it. So I'm like, okay, well now I want to try any other clone of it, because I also want to see, like, did anybody improve on it? Does it fix any of the things that other people don't like? And so, that kind of gear acquisition syndrome, like, I'm not a working musician, so, I just buy stuff and mess around with it, right?
Yeah.
So, I kind of have always had that, and with pedals, I consider them, I always call them guitar player candy, because it's like, I want to try all the little different flavors that you can get. So, but I always find it interesting when I talk to actual working musicians, like session players or touring guys, because you do see that a lot, where you see things that a lot of us would be like, oh, that's old. Like especially in modulation, where you're like, really, that's what you're using.
Yeah.
But if it, kind of the old adage of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
It's that for sure. And also, man, I've probably heard my guitar more through headphones now than I have standing in front of an amp.
Yeah.
And not all guitar tones that are really impressive to stand in front of record very well.
Yeah.
And And it's not a better or worse thing. It's just that there are simply things that translate, particularly when you're talking about bottom end,
Yeah.
that translate differently when you're standing in front of a cabinet. Even a 112 Princeton, like the sound of a or 110 Princeton, the sound of a little combo amp translates different when you're standing in front of it or when it's in a room with you than when you have it mic'd up and you're recording it. And so that's the other thing too that I maybe saw behind the curtain of a little bit is the thing, but some of that stuff that was so impressive to me when you would play it sitting in front of the amp.
Yep.
That by the time it went through a recording process, you were kind of like, oh, well, it sounds like another delay now, or it just sounds like another spring reverb. Man, that's crazy. When I was playing it in front, it just sounded like almost night and day how much cooler it was. And then you get to the end result, and it's kind of like, oh, yeah. Well, you know what? I guess at least it inspired me to play that part.
Yep. Well, I always found that with amps, like when I first started playing in a band, the first like real tube amp I got was a triple rectifier. And I remember like that feeling of playing, early 2000s hard rock stuff with a rectifier with a 4x12. I mean, when it's you in the room with that guitar, even when you're warming up at rehearsal, I mean, it feels amazing.
Yeah.
It's so gratifying.
Absolutely.
But I would always wonder, because earlier on when I was playing, I didn't understand, frequencies, where, what you needed to carve out. And I'm playing in a small hard rock and punk rock band. So you get into a band situation and you get on stage and all of a sudden you're like, why do I feel like I can't hear my guitar anymore? And it's because all of that stuff that's super gratifying is just gone once it's in a mix. And, and then that's when I start to realize like, oh, like this is not how guitar is recorded. This is not how guitar is mixed.
Yeah.
And when you finally, like the first time I got to sit down and play somebody else's rig in a studio that they were recording, and I put headphones on, I immediately took them off and I was like, how do you do this?
Yeah, right. It's devastating. Right?
Yeah, because it feels so horrible. Dude, or the first time I used inner monitors, I was like, this sounds awful.
Dude, I think that's, this is kind of a sidebar, but like, I think that's the number one thing that kills session careers, honestly, on anyone's instrument, is just hearing it in the headphones. And that's assuming that you got a great engineer.
Yeah.
But you also don't come up through the ranks without having a bunch of like rough sessions with bad gear. And sometimes it's no one's fault, but like you get in this weird spot where you don't really know the engineer well and they don't really know you well and no one really wants to question the other one, but the end result is this weird guitar tone that you're not thrilled with. And
yep.
And yeah, man, like I said, it's so hard to get used to hearing yourself in the cans, even when everything's great.
Yep.
And you have to overcome that. And touching briefly too on like what you're talking about, standing in front of the amp and stuff too, is like, dude, bottom end. I think it's like the ultimate the ultimate fear in the back of any guitar player's mind is that their tone is thin.
Yes.
Like, oh, thin tone. Everyone wants to have this fat tone, blah, blah. And, I know for me as a young, guitar player that the first thing I did was go for the bass knob.
Yeah.
And again, that kind of stuff can be really gratifying when you're standing in front of it. But when you're trying to carve things out in mixes and even a live mix, like to your point, even when you're standing on stage, like getting yourself to a point where you hear yourself.
Yeah.
And everybody else hears you. And, that kind of stuff was all just really, really eye-opening for me later in my life. And I had a really like kind of seminal moment for me. We were talking about him earlier, but the very first time I worked with Dann Huff in the studio.
Yep.
And dude, I was already edgy because Dan was my hero.
Yeah.
And I could not believe I had been called to come play guitar on a Dann Huff record. And the very first thing I had to play on that morning session, I remember it was a Billy Currington record, was this kind of like clean, like bluesy Strat sound. I'm like, well, this guy invented it right here, and I'm out there because there was a part on the demo and we're trying to create it, and I'm just shaking in my boots, And then there was, but in the chorus, the part I was playing, like he kept having me thin the guitar tone out, and he's having me turn knobs on the amp and do things, and really go all the way to the bridge, and all this kind of stuff. And it got to the point where it was almost uncomfortable for me to play.
Yep.
And I'm like, at this point, I'm just fighting the tunnel vision, because I'm going, this is Dan Huff, and he's, well, my tone's not right, and this and this and this, and then we went in to listen, and I was like, oh, it sounds perfect. I hear every note of everything, and it sounds perfect, and it's not too loud, and it's like, oh shit, and my head just exploded in Blackbird. We were in Blackbird A.
Yeah.
My head just exploded, and I was like, oh, and I realized that he had like Yoda'd me. He had just fucking totally Jedi'd me into, and turn this, and what's your bridge pickup sound, blah, blah, into like the perfect guitar tone for the part I was playing.
That's awesome.
And it forever, I mean, I certainly didn't walk out of there knowing everything there was to know, but it forever changed. I was probably 27, 28 maybe.
Yeah.
And it just forever changed the way I thought about recorded guitar tone.
I honestly, like, when I actually played in a band, I didn't know any of that. And our other guitar player had a 5152 at the time. I hated that amp. It sounded super, like, oversaturated, way too much gain, really fizzy sounding. And it drove me nuts, because when we were playing, I could hear him better than I could hear myself.
Yeah.
And it's because the mid-range on the 5150 was just right for, like, for that style of music. And it wasn't until well into me being at Revv that I like started to realize, like, oh, this is why. Like, this is why that was like that. And, when we were actually playing, you had no idea. And it's interesting because, again, like, YouTube didn't exist. The resources that guitar players have now to learn about that. I mean, I never once thought about putting an overdrive in front of a rectifier. Like,
yeah, sure.
Why would you?
Yeah, why bother?
So much gain, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's interesting that as your career evolves, that you figure out, like, all of these little things. And for me, a lot of it was watching pros and watching what they're doing. I'm like, why are they doing that? And then trying it, and then realizing, shit, that's why they're doing that.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right, man. Yeah, and like I said, I was just so lucky that when I kind of started getting into sessions, that there were just some really great engineers that I got to work with, and really great producers like Dan, and even producers that weren't guitar players, but like that just had such an ear for. There's another guy that I still work with to this day, as I do Dan, but his name's Frank Rogers, and he's really well known for having produced the early Brad Paisley records.
Okay.
And wrote a bunch of those songs, and he also produced a ton of other stuff in the country genre and outside the country, Sheryl Crow record, all kinds of stuff. But Frank's a guitar player, and his dad is a guitar player and guitar collector, and even though he never made that like his living, he's a good guitar player, and he's just got bigger than life ears in terms of sonics. And same thing, like doing some early records with Frank, and even some demos with Frank, sitting at Frank's really great home studio and doing some demos with him. And he had this great guitar collection, and he would have these kind of zen moments with me. He'd be like, hey, why don't you plug into this amp of mine? And I'd plug into this, whatever, his, what's the amp? Car.
Yes.
Car amps. Those are awesome amps.
Yeah.
And he had this really great, the Slant 6 head. Frank had, and he'd plug into that amp, and he'd turn some knobs, and kind of that thing we talk about where, like, woo, this doesn't sound like my stuff, but in this really cool way. And then you start looking at, how do you have the knobs? Oh wow, this is okay.
Yeah.
And just some of those eye-opening moments with those guys, or that thing where he'd be like, man, I like the part. What can we do about the sound? Is it a different guitar? Is it this? Is it maybe this? And switching till you have this moment where it starts to speak, and you go, oh, yeah. It's like all those kind of light bulb moments.
Yeah.
For me, accumulated over years and years and years and years. And still, by the way, like, still having those moments where you're chasing certain guitar sounds.
Yeah. Well, that was an interesting for me, that I find that, being in my position, because I'm one of the owners at Revv, I often get question because I own probably 30 or 40 amps that aren't Revs.
Sure. Yeah.
And a lot of guys have been like, well, like, these are competitive amps to you. Like,
sure.
And I'm like, no, they're not. I'm like, because everything has a different sound and a different flavor. I'm like, and sometimes, even though I don't really record guitars anymore, I'm like, I still want to sit down and have experience with that, right? Like, there's still something exciting about that. And that's kind of, I think, one of the hard things for people to realize in our industry, because every brand wants people to play their stuff, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the time brands get hung up on, you should only play our stuff. And I've always been the exact opposite, that I'm like, I'm hoping that we have something that we do that works for you for whatever scenarios you're in where you need that thing. But I know full well that sometimes a Friedman is going to be the thing. Sometimes it's going to be, it's going to be a Fender, it's going to be a Marshall or a Diesel or something. And like, that's totally fine with me.
Yeah.
Because that's also what's exciting. Because I also want to hear the best performance from who the artist is, right? And whatever gear gets them there, right? So it's always interesting to me when, talking to guitar players that have multiple amps to see what their kind of opinions are on that, right? Like, so You've got a bunch of stuff, and I'm kind of assuming based off the way you're talking that you kind of go through whatever fits the part. Like, you've got to find the thing that fits the song.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge part of it. And it's also like, because I want to touch on something you just said that I think is real interesting. It's like, if you start really going down that path of this like 1-for-1 replacement, if it's like, well, I just want to like say, as for instance, like say you're getting kind of tired of your triple rec, or maybe you don't even think you are, but you play maybe you play Diesel or whatever, you play one of the Revs and you go, oh man, I love this is great, this is blank's ass, or like, this is such a better version than my Tube Screamer or whatever. It's like, that's the stuff that I feel like is just endless, because no one is immune to what I call the tone cancer. And by that I mean that, like, no matter how great something is, it will become dull and boring to you over time.
Yep.
And if you go through that, like, oh well, this thing sounds so much better than this, I'd be like, does it? Because you might just be a little bored of the way that one sounds.
Yeah.
And there might actually be some really cool parts about that. And I was just fortunate enough over the years that, I didn't always have to like sell the thing when I got a new thing. And there were so many times when I went back to the other thing and plugged it in and was like, oh, fuck, this does sound great. Like, oh yeah, no wonder I use this all the time. And then it's not like you ditch the new one. You had this moment of being like, actually, these are both cool.
Yep.
And this is the thing. So the amps for me, too, have really come that way. And man, I realize how fortunate I am to have been successful enough to get some of this stuff. I was also really lucky that when I started getting into amps and vintage amps, the market was just not... I mean, I was buying Princeton reverbs for $500.
Yeah.
And, same thing with like some of these vintage Bassmans I have, and matchless amps. I bought that matchless amp at Rock Block. It's a Samson era Clubman, and I paid $1,200 for it.
Yeah.
So there's as an asterisk to this whole conversation.
Yes.
There's the thing. But yeah, for me, it still was this like chasing the Muse thing, where the first nice amp I ever bought myself was a Top Hat.
Oh yeah.
And I loved it. So it was a great amp, and I would still have that. It got killed in the Nashville flood of 2010 with a bunch of other stuff I had. I would still have that amp if I did. But that was the first like nice amp I ever bought myself, that wasn't like a PV.
Yeah.
Or my dad had kind of perma-loaned me this drip edge Bassman head, for a while.
Yep.
And but I bought that amp. And for the longest time, that was the only amp I had. And I was lugging that head around in a cabinet. I was too stupid to have bought a combo. Yeah. I bought a head and I had a cabinet, and I was hauling that shit around forever. And so then, it was like, at a point, I remember going into, Rock Block, and I had a little bit of walking around money, and I bought a Dr. Z KTM 45 because I went in there and played it and just thought, this amp sounds awesome.
Yeah.
And, it certainly wasn't better than that top hat I had. It was different to me.
Yeah.
And that it sounded fresh.
Yep.
And I played so many amps in Rock Block that like it was a comfortable environment. Like they would let me bring my own guitar in there to play amps. And
Yep.
And I knew, I was like, well, through my telly, this sounds awesome. Oh, bought that amp. And, that kind of process just slowly started to, was happening. And at the time, I don't want to say no one thought Fender amps were cool, because Fender's Fender and they always were. But this was an era where there was an influx of these new boutique amps.
Yes.
Matchless was kind of in this, early 2000s, like Matchless was in this weird transitional phase. And I think a lot of people saw the market for a new boutique kind of Class A amplifier that, if they could get the price point right, that a lot of people would be into, know. And so I did that for a long time and kind of had to like back into the Fenders, quite a few years in, and started buying that stuff. And so again, it was all just from this point of like, I'd use something till I kind of got a little bored with it.
Yep.
And then I'd just go into Rock Block one day or Star Corner, and they'd be like, hey, you should check these out. We got these in. They're pretty cool, man. So-and-so just bought one. Okay. And you check it out. And if it was inspiring for me, it kind of stopped there. It's kind of like, okay, man, wow, this is really cool. Okay, well, it's only got one knob on it. All right. It sounds cool.
Yep.
And I wasn't looking at this like I want to replace or I think this is better than.
Yeah.
At that point, it was still just like, again, the gas. It was acquisition. And I was young and didn't have a lot of overhead and, had a roommate and was just a guitar player, trying to do stuff. And I was able to buy some of that stuff. And so, fast forward, I don't even know how many amps I have at this point, man, which is almost embarrassing. But I can say that all the amps I have, I use.
Yeah.
And that's the reality of where I'm at. And so back to your kind of original question, like the casting, there's a little bit of that, like, well, what kind of record are we trying to make here?
Yeah.
And like, I'm not gonna, if it's a traditional country record, like, I'm not gonna try to like turn every knob on my triple rec.
Yeah.
To make it sound like some sort of, Telecaster tone when I have the luxury of these other things that I know are probably more in line with what's used on those records. But I definitely know there have been overlap in the ways that, like, I definitely know I've done, like, really country guitar, like, Telecaster sounds through some amps that people might not have thought, like through an old Plexi.
Yep.
Or stuff like that, because in the moment there was something cool about the mid-range that was happening, and I just thought, man, hey, this sounds cool. Yeah, it wouldn't have been my first thought, but sounds pretty cool. Everyone here's loving it, so we'll ride this out.
Yeah, one of my favorite things when I get anything new, whether it's something vintage, but like once I get an amp that is new to me, one of my favorite things is trying to figure out what it shouldn't be able to do.
Yeah, you find the edges.
Right? Yep, exactly. And be like, okay, so can you, does this amp clean up well? I mean, we did a live stream a week or two ago where we were talking about pedal platform amps. And I went through and I'm like, how does a 5153 take pedals? And I was shocked at how well it did, because I was like, this amp's not going to be good for this.
Sure.
Right? And it was awesome. Mm-hmm. Same with like the Bogner Ecstasy. I'm like, this takes pedals better than I thought it would, because this amp kind of does everything, like drive-wise, it does everything inside the box. You don't need any pedals with that amp. And I like finding those things out and figuring out, okay, these, especially high-gain amps, I love taking high-gain amps and being like, can I bring these to edge of breakup and have them not feel stiff and shitty? Like, is it going to work?
Yeah.
That's kind of one of my favorite things to do when we get stuff. And I was fortunate, too, that, like, I started getting old Fenders before they got ridiculous, and I bought my I have a 66 Bassman head that I bought for $800.
Yeah.
And I mean, that doesn't happen anymore.
Nah, dude.
And what actually started me off on checking out a bunch of different amps was when I was working for Two Notes. When I first got the Torpedo Live, we were doing videos, and we had a couple of old Fenders and a couple of Marshalls. And at the time, I hated Marshalls.
Yeah.
I felt that they were thin and didn't work for me. And I played a JMP, and I played a really good JCM 800.
Yeah.
And then that sent me off on, like, oh, now I'm going to hunt down Fenders and Marshalls wherever I can and see if they're good.
Yeah. Well, you also, I think a lot of us have these stories of plugging into a certain amp in whatever scenario it was and being like, whoa, that's terrible. But you realize, I mean, we were talking about this earlier too, like backline amps or sometimes even amps at a store and look, man, I know everyone, no one wants to like point a finger at their own quality control, but every once in a while too, a dog gets shipped out.
Yep.
And I know for me, I've done it just long enough now to have had myself proved wrong a few times where I've plugged into so-and-so's Marshall or this Marshall at this place or this whatever amp.
Yep.
And been like, that thing sounded terrible. And then years later, you have an opportunity to check out a different one and you go, actually, this one's great, man. I wonder what was up or what. Maybe my head just wasn't in it that day or maybe my ears were fried or whatever.
That was me with the JCM 800. I had played, I don't know how many of them, either in backline or friends of them that had them. And man, I hated every one of them. And then I played a 50-watt JCM 800 that's an 85.
Yeah.
Then it was unbelievable.
And speaker combination is a huge part of it too. We talked about that earlier. Like that's that all those combinations are definitely not created equal. Also, so I would probably hate a lot of amps if they were paired with the wrong speaker.
Yeah, for sure.
Or one that's about to blow or whatever, which that stuff's not always as easy to hear as everyone thinks it is.
Yeah,
sometimes it is and it isn't. But
yeah, man. Well, hey, man, thanks for taking time and chatting gear with us today.
Yeah, of course, man. Yeah.
Loads of fun.
Yeah, dude. Happy to do it, man. Anytime.
Awesome.